Welcome to Voices of the Community, which explores critical issues facing Northern California communities. We introduce you to the voices of community thought leaders and change makers who are working on solutions that face our fellow individual community members, neighborhoods, cities, and our region. This is George Koster, your host. This episode is part of our series exploring COVID-19's impact on nonprofits and small businesses in the San Francisco Bay Area. Back in April of 2020, when we decided to create this ongoing series on COVID-19's impact, first on nonprofits and then on small businesses in the San Francisco Bay Area, we, like you, had no idea how long the pandemic would go on and what the health and economic impact would be in our community. With vaccinations increasing, COVID-19 cases and deaths decreasing, we're now moving into the summer of 2021 with the reopening of the economy and all of the uncertainty of our ever-changing indoor and outdoor, vaccinated and unvaccinated protocols, and the politics that will drive how we all come back together as a unified or fractured community. We will continue to shine a spotlight on the nonprofits and small businesses that make up the fabric of our community, along with the founders and staff who are struggling to deal with the impact of the COVID-19 pandemic on their operations, services, and sustainability until we can all get to the other side of the pandemic. Along the way, we will also share with you all the amazing solutions that our nonprofits, small businesses, foundations, and government leaders are working on to help us all get to the other side of the pandemic and come together to rebuild our communities with more economic, social, and environmental equality.
What would an organizational legal structure look like that could do all of those things and organize people around their own future in their own communities while leaving them in power as opposed to abdicating power to what often are majority white boards and a nonprofit industrial complex that would keep this hypothetical entity on the treadmill of a beggarly posture toward the goodwill industry of philanthropic investment and donation.
This is the Executive Director of the East Bay Permanent Real Estate Cooperative, Noni Session. We wanted to host the East Bay Permanent Real Estate Cooperative on the show because they've developed a unique grassroots model to address some of the systemic housing and community issues that have faced our communities for over the last 50 plus years. I'm joined remotely by the Executive Director of the East Bay Permanent Real Estate Cooperative, Noni Session. Welcome to Voices of the Community, Noni.
Thanks so much for having me, George. I really appreciate it.
I would love it if you could provide our audience an overview of the East Bay Permanent Real Estate Cooperative and your model for real estate and your programs and a little history.
So the East Bay Permanent Real Estate Cooperative is a Black and people of color-led, multi-stakeholder land and housing investment cooperative. That's the mouthful. That's always a challenge because there's many facets to what it is we do. But the core of the work is to mobilize capital that, as we refer to it, is non-extractive capital or low interest capital in order to find, purchase, develop, and support community leaders in long-term asset managing through building cooperative governance structures and financial skill sets and organizing skill sets so that there's a collective wealth building process that will take our communities into a future that really otherwise is promising to exclude them in terms of control of the future of their neighborhoods. That's a pretty expansive sentence I just gave you there, but it's expansive, and really East Bay Permanent Real Estate Cooperative exists because we know that there is a pretty daunting and multidimensional task ahead of us to conserve communities that have really been decimated due to rapid racialized and classed displacement. I mentioned both racialized displacement and class displacement because as you start to dig into the issue of what's happening in our cities nationwide, you presume it's a Black and brown issue, but it really is sort of endemic and systematic municipal neglect of many of our cities, many of our citizens, many of our communities. All the way back in 2014, some of us recognized that we needed to rethink the model of owning land and housing and the models that get you there. That is the real estate market and the finance and movement of capital markets, in order to have even a slight hope of remediating the consequences of increasing bodies of renters, increasing bodies of landlords with mass holdings where humans, communities, histories were treated more like commodities and subjects of the market, as opposed to the things and the people and the places that ground us into an identity and a future in the United States. Back in 2014, I was myself founding a grassroots organization called State of Black Oakland, where about 13 of us were building a Black People's Assembly in Oakland that really seeked to advocate for Black Oaklanders, just as rapid racialized displacement was really making itself clear as we started to see the statistics and the consequences in our communities. Around the same time, a lawyer, Janelle Orsi, one of the co-founders of the Sustainable Economies Law Center, wrote a white paper called Ownership is Dead, and really asking the question of what do we do about the crisis of ownership for frontline communities when all of the tools that we have to work with are broken tools, indicative of multiple crashes in the real estate market, indicated by repetitive arcs of predatory lending, indicated by the ratio of renters rising while the rate of displacement matched, and indicated by the absence of resources and wealth in Black and Brown communities compared to our white counterparts. Janelle and some of the lawyers at Sustainable Economies Law Center began to work to change a critical California securities law, AB 816, that raised the cap on non-accredited investors, that is, folks with a net worth of $1 million or that raised the cap on their ability to invest in a cooperative enterprise, where at the time, a non-accredited investor could only invest up to $350 in a cooperative endeavor. And the exemption that they wrote in through AB 816 raised that cap to $1,000. What that means is that you can aggregate community dollars much more quickly to make a purchase, particularly in a hot market like Oakland, the Bay Area, where 400 people means a down payment on $1 million plus property. Around the same time, Sustainable Economies Law Center converged with a group of Black Oaklanders called People of Color Sustainable Housing Network, who also recognized that as the Bay Area experienced its rapid changes, as the population exploded, and in some ways, even as the diversity in the Bay Area exploded, the folks who you didn't see in those new faces, those new careers, those new ways of being were Black and Brown folks, particularly legacy and longtime Black and Brown Oaklanders. So we got circus performers and metal workers and software engineers and gardeners, but those populations of people who were being housed, who were being supported with loans, who were being supported by city policy were increasingly white descended and new members of our community. So Sustainable Economies Law Center and People of Color Sustainable Housing Network found that their vision and their question for what kind of experimental structures we could create to be a legal and financial holding container for collective Black ownership and to secure land and space and place for Oaklanders led to them beginning to conceive an organization for which they began to write bylaws. What would an organizational legal structure look like that could do all of those things and organize people around their own future in their own communities while leaving them in power as opposed to abdicating power to what often are majority white boards and a nonprofit industrial complex that would keep this hypothetical entity on the treadmill of a beggarly posture toward the goodwill industry of philanthropic investment and donation. Pretty grand hopes, I would say.
So, Noni, that kind of leads me to dig a little bit deeper into your Esther's Orbit Room and the 7th Street Cultural Corridor Revitalization Plan, because that appears to be your pilot program for the concept.
Yeah, actually, so interesting because there are 2 housing acquisitions we've made prior to Esther's Orbit Room. Esther's Orbit Room is our first commercial mixed-use acquisition. Our first acquisition is now fondly known as Co-op 789, which is a multi-unit apartment building in North Oakland, really our testing ground for could we run a real estate organization and bring in direct investment and cooperate with the residents to organize and define how they would autonomously govern themselves in partnership with our organization. I mean, big question. Thank goodness that our first endeavor out of the box were with natural organizers and natural cooperators. I love those people. And our second project was pretty groundbreaking in that our partner in Just Transition, Carolyn North, an elderly dancer, felt like one of the critical pathways to a just transition is that folks who are high net worth and wealth holders should not and shall not seek to hoard their generational wealth away from communities who have been deprived and explicitly disinvested and dispossessed of their access to generational wealth. So as Carolyn began to see the end to her life after giving her children their inheritance and supporting one of our amazing partners, Planting Justice, in buying a farm in El Sobrante to which she would retire, she donated her single family home with a detached dance studio to East Bay Permanent Real Estate Cooperative in order that we move forward her mission of housing Black and Brown working artists in dignified, beautiful, affordable, and permanent environments. And in addition, the detached dance studio allows an extra revenue stream so that livelihood and life becomes even more possible. Their ability to act on their community, on their futures, on their visions becomes even more possible with access to more space that essentially they're not being gouged to have, right? That they're governing in partnership with East Bay Permanent Real Estate Cooperative. And the seed of that extra revenue stream really started to fertilize our thinking. Like we sort of played around with it rhetorically early on, like, ooh, what if we were able to create more access to resources with the asset itself? Right? What if we could turn these assets into something that could really create endless stability for as many people as possible so that their energy and their visions are freed up from debt, which often you can position rent as lifelong debt, for transformation, for transformative energy. Although we thought our next project was going to be a multi-unit apartment building where we wanted to experiment with organizing a high number of tenants. So that's actually going to be our fourth project, like a 15 to 20 unit residential building. As we looked around the city for our next project, 7th Street kind of fell into our laps because our organizing partner, Mandela Grocery Cooperative on 7th Street, which is the only Black-owned grocery store we've had in Oakland in 30 years, the only grocery cooperative Oakland has ever had. Also, around the time I converged with Sustainable Economies Law Center and People of Color Housing Network, Mandela Grocery Cooperative was fertilizing my cooperative vision, where I began to understand cooperatives as the seed of the solution for Black liberation, for community revitalization, and for a clear path to economic resilience that's really been withheld from us as we see the sort of loss of heavy industry, the movement to a service and an ephemeral economy, the breaking of labor power. And there haven't been really any clear pathways back to strength for the people, if you will. Hopefully that doesn't land as a cliche, but really the humans that live and make this place a vital, vibrant place. My eyes were really opening to how possible it is to transform whole bodies of people through returning to them a sense of economic power, because with it comes a sense of social power. And as we were in about our second or third year, our partners, Mandela Grocery, asked us to help them think about how we could ground a project on the corridor. And we convened a 6-month process called the Black Economic Salon. We called it a salon because we thought it was just going to be a conversation to think about how we could revitalize a Black economic base in Oakland. Within 2 meetings, because there's been such a thirst for generations to renew this vision, we had formed committees, retail, culture, and daily life, environment, and began to write a business plan for a cooperative project that would support and move resources to as many cooperative owners as possible, and that would become a business that could share resources with the surrounding community who had been deprived of real essential services for generations. When you go over to 7th Street in West Oakland, within 2 miles, there are no essential services besides for Mandela Grocery Cooperative, which began 10 years ago, struggled until 5, and is now turning a profit, and as one of the few businesses over there whose specific model is to nourish our neighborhood. That's their motto, which is so gorgeous. And working with them, I realized that this project of gentrification is far from complete because we did a lot of door knocking as the grocery store to raise awareness. And I realized how many Black and brown people were behind these doors who had been sort of driven inside because of this absence of resource, this absence of safety through over-policing, this absence of a sense of access to community and serendipitous spaces with which to accidentally see, converge with, and fertilize one another. And as we sort of trolled the corridor for opportunity, we were throwing a few community breakfasts. And as EB Prec began to sort of talk to people about its next project, we realized that we had this buried jewel. So Mandela's at the foot of the corridor at Mandela Parkway, which used to be Cypress Way and 7th Street. And Esther's Orbit Room is at the head of the corridor at 7th and Wood Street before you move on to the port. We realized there was this buried jewel that actually was emblematic of how one thing, one asset has been and can be again a nexus around which many other economic, social, and cultural activities can ground themselves and then grow. Particularly knowing that pre-pandemic, 7th Street holds the West Oakland BART station, which sits kind of at the threshold of many of the revenue drawing spaces in the Bay Area. It's the last stop before San Francisco. So it takes all the San Francisco overflow and really the last stop before Silicon Valley. West Oakland has held historically, economically, environmentally, borne much of the brunt of the negative outcomes of moving goods and services out to the rest of the region. We've had some of the highest levels of asthma after like Fresno, adverse health outcomes, lack of economic opportunity and economic control. But despite that, there were 250,000 individuals that crossed that corridor every day pre-pandemic coming from Silicon Valley, coming from San Francisco, where there were no essential or leisure services within walking distance from a neighborhood and a corridor that folks have been desperate to revitalize for over 30 years. So we realized that as locals and as natives who had really seized on an economic model that could bring in capital that was non-extractive, meaning money that was inexpensive enough to support an affordable acquisition. We realized that as folks who had deep insider knowledge, we knew where the value was that we could tap into, meaning an untapped customer population, meaning that in innovative business models, we know that you build business around building community and building community support. Somehow, when it comes to community development, those innovations seem to sort of fall to the side when in fact, that is how you activate your customer base, by building your community base. We knew that we had a community that was thirsty for connection and vision and places to play those relationships out. And we also knew that in order to move forward our vision for more housing, that we had to break the stigma attached to this idea of old or new approaches to creating and building affordable housing. If you will, the concept of affordable housing has really been ghettoized, both in the imagination and in the sense of technical approaches. So one of the things that I really push is that we are not an affordable housing developer. We are a community-led real estate developer that acquires permanent, affordable, and community-controlled land and housing for the future of our neighborhoods. So Esther's Orbit Room presented itself as the opportunity to model how you could ground people into the revenue model as residents who live above in the mixed use space and create a abundant resource that would also feed the neighbors and the neighborhood that surrounds the acquisition through the kind of programming that you put into place in relationship to the commercial space, the residential space, and the extra outdoor space around it. So we're acquiring 3 parcels. One is the historic Esther's Orbit Room performance venue and bar. The old coffee shop next door is set to be something like a fine arts gallery and a movement arts gallery for yoga, potentially healing arts like Reiki. The parking lot in the back will front out to a cafe that will sort of be situated in the center, kind of directly in the middle of all 3 parcels, that will then open out onto a parking lot and a garden so that there's community activation space. And in partnership with Mandela Grocery Cooperative, we're going to be looking to ground a Black and Brown farmers market back into West Oakland for the first time ever, and looking to build a model. So part of our work is not just to galvanize the impact capital, not just to develop the project, not simply to tap community leaders to give the projects to, but to help build internal structures, cooperative governance, autonomous governance, long-term asset management, and a vision for community transformation into our co-management agreement so that we're positioning people to create long-term change where the land and housing is protected by our bylaws, and we continue to support them with a runway of capital to really get them on their feet, the way we know has been a successful model for all ventures that take place, at least on the American landscape.
Thank you. That was very detailed. I love it. And you're seeing it as a cultural corridor revitalization because 7th Street was Harlem of the West, as described on your website, by the way. I like the history piece of it as well. And like so many downtowns bisected by a freeway that fell down and then has now been rebuilt. And then you've got massive amounts of development going in around the BART station, so lots of gentrification. So what's the status now on the cultural corridor revitalization project? Do you have your direct public offering out there?
Yes. So one thing I forgot to mention is that I'm a 3rd generation West Oaklander. So 3 generations of my family have lived, worked, played, succeeded, and failed right where we're doing this project. So it's been pretty interesting to me to be able to use that sort of personal, historical, social body of cultural knowledge to begin to build this vision that there is the possibility for a cultural corridor to be revitalized, right? Because as you mentioned, when you're standing there kind of as what you might call a sort of like outside observer, it seems that the possibility of recreating, if you will, a space for regular folk to be able to stroll a boulevard and access goods and services and relationships is really out of reach at this point, given the projects that do have entitlement on the corridor, given the loss of space through the BART station, the post office, the fallen Cypress Freeway, the 980 freeway, and just the shortage of resources in general. There are a lot of unleveraged footprints that are not only not readily apparent to folks who are often trying to move projects that will generate high levels of profit. We're talking 6, 7, 11% and above. There's also space that we know, because we are locals and live around here, have been unleveraged due to concepts like rent blight, meaning where by 2017, the median rent for a 1-bedroom was topping out at $3,500 a month. So because we know from experience that if we are not simply conceding to the conventions of the market, conventions of so-called community development techniques, and conventions of the finance system, right? Those are key things that we reject and push against in our process. So for those folks who are choosing to advance other assumptions about those devices, we can clearly see that there's a huge investment capacity for the corridor, not just a human investment capacity and a capital investment capacity, but there's a capacity to renew and unearth some long buried cultural assets that can really animate so many processes for so many different people at many different levels of need, and on not just the corridor, but around the census tract. There's about 40,000 people just in the precinct around 7th Street, not to mention the adjacent precincts. So knowing that and really thinking toward that, our partners at Sustainable Economies Law Center, along with our brilliant and diligent Director of Finance, Ojan Mobed-Shahi, we wrote it as a group process. We wrote our own SEC paperwork to be approved to sell securities, which is what a direct public offering is, nationwide at $1,000 a share. You can now buy from us as many shares as you would like at a projected 1.5% return over a 5 to 10-year term. It's unusual and unheard of for a grassroots organization to write its own DPO paperwork and be approved. It took us a year because we knew that we were headed in this direction. We knew that there was a very deep and wide investment capacity for untapped nodes of our neighborhood throughout Oakland, throughout the East Bay, because those untapped nodes are really active, are really dependent on tapping local knowledge and local leadership for opportunities that you cannot find on Redfin. These are opportunities you have to find through relationship. These are opportunities that make themselves seen through really attempting to meet people's needs. These are opportunities that we want to offer to folks who want to see their capital do more in the world than support the buying and selling of commodities, the subdivisions of a thing to which you sell to other things, which are then taking precedence over humans and cultures and history. So this DPO, where we have a $50 million capacity to raise over the next 3 years with a 1-year extension, means that as opportunity sites open up for us on the corridor, we're making sure that we're in the posture to be ready to take on those opportunities on behalf of our community members. And there's a lot buried there. Even the possibilities that are opening up around Esther's are surprising both newcomers and locals every day.
And Noni, in the time that you've been working on all this, could you share with the audience one of your favorite stories?
I guess my favorite stories really have started to surface even before I realized that our project would be grounded, that the real sort of watershed of our work would be grounded through a commercial acquisition, was when I started to realize what kind of treasure had been buried in West Oakland for me by my parents. Apparently, my mom was one of the original members of this project called Model Cities, which for like colloquial time frame we would call back in the day. But I think it was the mid-70s where Model Cities was attempting to revitalize Oakland. And I started to run into elders who would ask me things like, "What's your name again, baby?" And I'm like, "Oh, my name is Noni Session." "Is your mom Carolyn Session?" "She gave me my first job." I'd run into old guys who were like, "Hey, girl, what's your name again?" "My name is Noni Session." "You know a man named Major Session?" "Yes, that's my dad." "I went to high school with your dad." So I think it really started to make me ask questions. Like, I saw a sort of desolate landscape like everyone else when they looked at West Oakland. And folks started to tell me their stories. And those stories started to sort of position themselves on this landscape where even I couldn't see their ghost. I couldn't see their resonation. But you realize that people have lived these whole lives of joy and fulfillment that look very different from a deserted bar to them. And it really started to infuse both. I'm a cultural anthropologist by training, so I collect stories and extrapolate data from social stories. And I started to really see this almost like psychogeographical mapping of West Oakland, where Esther's is actually the center. And so the most exciting part is every single time, to the person, I would mention that we were working toward raising the full capital to buy Esther's, there is a story to match every time I've remarked upon this project, every time. So that's not necessarily a favorite moment, But that's one of my favorite flows about this project, because as an anthropologist, when people start offering you stories, they're offering you history. I want to say this in sort of a social scientist way, but they're offering you mathematics. They're offering you the ability and the privilege to put the pieces together and understand arcs of history and time and politics through the eyes of ground level humans. So that's not quite an answer to your question, but that's my favorite thing about what's happening here in my life today.
That's good. I like the mathematical equation of it all. That's a good one. So folks who are listening to the show, how can they support the East Bay Permanent Real Estate Cooperative? How could they get engaged?
Yeah. We're living in a time where information flows are really overdefined by large conglomerates. And what has been most powerful about this project has been word of mouth, not just in our local neighborhood, but even statewide. Folks are reaching out from other countries, from other municipalities to ask about this project, both the model, the opportunity to support, the opportunity to learn from our learnings. So the greatest gift that we can receive from any listeners today is to share our information with your networks, your friends, your neighbors, your mom, your donor advised fund, your friends who are trying to launch their own nascent projects, your local municipality who is looking to revitalize futures for their people there. And you can find more information on us at www.ebprec.org. After investment of your time and your relationships, there comes the investment of your capital. We have community owners who can join to be part of our governance mechanism. And dues are $5 a week, a month, or a year. If you don't have the $5, we will pay the $5 for you. I think it's $10. Okay, this is $10. We'll pay it for you because we want folks to really invest in this future and not just stand back and watch it. You can join, if you're not local, you can join as a sustainer to support us with $5 a week, a month, or a year. You can donate directly to the project, either for a non-tax deductible benefit through our website. For a tax deductible benefit, you can donate to us through SELC, www.selc.org. And you can invest, every investment in EBPREC goes into our general fund, but is earmarked for the project on which we are working at the time. So you can invest in the Esther's Orbit Room project by investing in ebprec.org, www.ebprec.org/invest. Please read our investment circular before you make any decisions. And you can reach out to us to share more of our story on your network. We have assets for you. We consider that the work of champions who really want to spread our word nationwide. And you can reach out to Noni, Noni, at ebprec.org. You can reach out to info@ebprec.org. And we look forward to hearing from you and sharing more about the vision we have for this city and this region and really this nation.
And if someone wanted to volunteer, could they also do that as well?
Yes, we have such trouble holding volunteer work, but we're building a body of folks who can really support us as we move forward with our galvanizing and trying to identify where our gaps are, where we could use particularly technical support. So please don't hesitate to reach out to us. Even if we can't hold your support at this moment, we will definitely need it over the next 2 years as we develop this project and activate the community around it.
Noni, our final question for today, what do you think are some of the positive things that could come out of the pandemic and crisis to support your work with residents, small businesses, the arts and creative economy in West Oakland?
My favorite thing, as I mentioned, I'm a third generation West Oaklander, and I have seen, experienced, been the object of the Black community and Black bodies being policed and ordinanced out of public space at many different stages of my development here. And what's been kind of exciting and opportune for, in my opinion, and I think in our opinion as EBPREC, is that because the pandemic has kind of forced us to think about space in a more open air sense, not symbolically, actually, our design that's coming out of the revitalization of this project, our community engagement, our community galvanizing, has really been an opportunity to program Black presence back into public space, right? There's no longer the demand that Blackness remains invisible for the danger of being aggressed upon for not being invisible. So our design for our gallery space, we're thinking about like a full breezeway, pull up open air doors where folks can kind of just wander in off the street and accidentally converse with one another. We're thinking about outdoor galvanizations right on the very sidewalk to reclaim and demonstrate to passersby who lives here, who owns this neighborhood. So for me, and I think for our work of organizing, it's been really exciting to think about coming out of the darkness and into the light in the way that we connect and reconnect with our natal home and our vision for our future.
Thank you. It's a great vision. Lots of work has already gone into it and lots of work ahead. Thank you, Noni, for sharing the wonderful insights from your work at East Bay Permanent Real Estate Cooperative with the West Oakland community. We will make sure that listeners have your contact information, website, social media, so they can follow along with your great work in the community and participate in one of your upcoming orientation events and get engaged with your work and support your work there in West Oakland, to your point, for folks to take back their community. So please stay safe and healthy as we all work our way through this strange new pseudo-normalcy.
Indeed. You as well, George. Thank you so much.
That's it for this episode of Voices of the Community. You've been listening to the voice of the Executive Director of the East Bay Permanent Real Estate Cooperative, Noni Session. To find out more about the East Bay Permanent Real Estate Cooperative programs, as well as getting engaged as an investor and volunteer, please go to ebprec.org. We really want to hear from you in our short listener survey, so please go to georgecoster.com and click on the survey button on the upper right-hand side of the homepage and provide us your feedback and insights. Please tune in to KSFP 102.5 FM to next week's show on August 12th at 8:30 a.m., where we share the voices from St. Anthony's about their extensive wraparound support programs to help bring stability to our unhoused and low-income community members. We hope that you enjoyed the insights, points of view, and personal stories from the voices of changemakers and their nonprofits and small businesses featured in this series. To find out more and get engaged with the nonprofits, small businesses, and staff members featured in the series, please go to my website, georgecoster.com, and click on Voices of the Community to find links to the extended versions of these interviews and to listen to the entire series. After listening to these stories, we hope that you will consider making a donation and volunteering to provide a hand up to your fellow community members. I want to thank my associate producer, Eric Estrada, and Casey Nance at Citron Studios, along with the wonderful crew at the San Francisco Public Press and KSFP. Voices of the Community is a member of Intersection for the Arts, which allows us to offer you a tax deduction for your contributions. Please go to georgecoster.com and click on the donate link to make a donation to help us provide future shows just like this one. While you're on our website, you can enjoy our archived past shows, which feature community voices working on solutions to critical issues facing Northern California communities. And you can sign up for our newsletter to find out more about future shows, as well as shows and events from the organizations that are included in our episodes. Take us along on your next COVID walk by subscribing to Voices of the Community on Apple Podcast, Spotify, and Google Podcast, or wherever you get your podcast. You can follow us on Twitter at George Coster, and we'd love to hear from you with feedback and show ideas, so send us an email to george@georgecoster.com. I'm George Coster in San Francisco, and thank you for listening.